Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I would like to thank our participants for joining us and the Southeast ATTC for this invitation. First, to tell you a little bit about myself, and my name is Darice Orobitg. I am a clinical psychologist here in Puerto Rico. I did my undergrad studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and then my Ph.D. in San Juan, Puerto Rico at the Carlos Albizu University. I worked for a little over 10 years at the Puerto Rico Rape Crisis Center. So most of my clinical experience, specifically with gender-based violence, comes from that experience. I'm getting a message that there's an issue with the audio, so I'm gonna adjust the volume just a bit. So most of my clinical experience comes from that. Also, I worked at Proyecto Mujer in San Juan, in Bayamón, Puerto Rico. So Proyecto Mujer is a gender-specific integrated treatment program for Latinas with substance use disorders and trauma experiences. So that's to tell you a little bit about the kind of work that I do. Nowadays I have my private practice that I've had since 2005, and I'm also working as a content specialist for the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health TTC. I also worked as a trainer and TA consultant for the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center. Okay, so today we will be speaking about the intersection between gender-based violence, trauma, substance use disorders, and the particularities of Latinas who had those experiences. So today's objectives include naming statistical data about violence experiences among Latinas and the general population, discussing cultural values that may be relevant for Latinas and the treatment of Latinas, addressing possible intersections between violence experiences, trauma, and substance use among women and Latinas, identifying elements of culturally responsive treatments, and naming effective models for the treatment of women. Those are today's objectives. There are some terms that it's important for us to discuss when we speak about gender and gender violence. Sex. The World Health Organization describes sex as the biological and physiological characteristics of men and women, including reproductive organs, chromosomes, and hormones. However, when we speak about gender, according to the World Health Organization as well, it refers to socially defined characteristics of men and women as well as their roles and relationships. So what is expected according to gender varies from culture to culture, and it may change over time. So gender includes social concepts of functions, behaviors, and attributes that each society considers appropriate for men and for women. So different functions and behaviors may generate inequalities between the genders, meaning differences between groups that may systematically favor one group over another. And what we find in our societies is that this results in power imbalances, with men usually holding positions of power. So this is something that, again, may have other consequences, such as inequalities in such things as health, access to services, and violence experiences. I would also like to acknowledge that it is important to recognize identities that may not fit the binary categories of male and female. So norms, relationships, and roles that are associated with gender also impact health results among transgender and intersex groups. So even though we are not going to address this specifically, we recognize the impact of these categories on all gender identities. So victimization among girls and women. Some of the types of experiences that women and girls have include sexual abuse, physical and emotional abuse, witnessing intimate partner violence, poverty, racism, and sexism. So the literature points out that women and girls are more vulnerable to experience certain types of violence and victimizations. So this is true for Latinas, and this is true for women in general. This is evidenced by the SALA study. I don't know if some of you are familiar with the SALA study. It's a sexual assault among Latinas that was published in 2008. So this vulnerability sometimes results from the power imbalances that we discussed earlier. In terms of gender-based violence and substance use disorders, again, the literature highlights that among women with substance use disorder, there's a higher rate of intimate partner violence and sexual violence experiences. So taking from my experience, for example, in Proyecto Mujer, as I mentioned, it was an gender-specific integrated treatment program. One of the things that we found is that between 95 and 97% of our participants who came to treatment for substance use had experiences of violence. Some of the most salient ones, the most common ones, were intimate partner violence and sexual violence. So this is the reason, and again the literature supports this. We're going to be discussing this. We're going to be discussing intimate partner violence and sexual violence because they are the most common that we find with the intersection with substance use. Not only this, not only women are vulnerable to experience violence, but also polyvictimization in women. So we may find that women experience more than one violent act. So polyvictimization refers to multiple acts of violence, and it's different than experiencing, for example, sexual abuse from ages 8 to 12. That's an experience, that's a prolonged experience, that's a very difficult experience. So we're not saying that one experience is better or worse than the other. They're both really difficult experiences. But what we want to say is that it is important to explore the different types of victimization that someone may have experienced in order to address them properly. So the experiences will be different, so that means that probably the manifestation of symptoms is going to be different, and the way that we approach them is going to be specific to the needs of that person. So let's define some other terms. Intimate partner violence describes physical, sexual, and psychological harm by a current or former partner or spouse. This type of violence can occur among heterosexual couples, same-sex couples, and does not require sexual intimacy. Okay. So I want to share with you, I don't know if some of you may be familiar with Duluth Power and Control wheel. This was used at a program in Duluth, and I like it a lot because it includes different dimensions that are related to physical and sexual violence. So it includes using intimidation, using emotional abuse, such things as putting someone down, name calling, mind games. It includes isolation. It includes minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, using male privilege, using economy abuse. So someone may not be able to use money on their own, so they may depend on their partner for for money to buy basic things, and using coercion and threats. Okay. So this is a very complete power and control wheel, and I invite you to look it over and see all the areas that it addresses. What about sexual violence? Sexual violence is defined as an act committed against someone. It's a sexual act committed against someone without their consent. So the issue of consent is a very important issue, okay? Consent involves communication, and it should happen every single time there's a sexual contact. So if two people agree to engage in a sexual act, they communicate their consent to each other. There are some variables that may hinder the ability for someone to consent, and this may include age. It also may include cognitive capacity. So you want to make sure that the person consents to the act. Okay, there are different manifestations to sexual violence, and they include sexual assault, child sexual abuse, sodomy, incest, exposure to sexual acts or pornography, sexual harassment, and I'm including intimate partner violence in the sense that sexual violence to a partner is also sexual violence. So I also want to point out that the term sexual violence is not a legal term. Okay, so definitely there are legal definitions of this act of violence, and they may change from state to state. So it is important that we know these laws. But also, if we are working with a survivor of sexual abuse, sexual violence, what we want to know is the experience of that person, and we want to be able to validate that experience as violence, regardless of what the laws may say. Yes, the laws are important, but in a therapeutic context, we want to be able to validate experience. So I mentioned before the SALA study, the sexual assault among Latinas, and I'm going to share with you some of the data that they obtained from that study. So to tell you a little bit about how it took place, so what they wanted to explore was they took a national sample of about 2,000 Latinas to determine the extent of sexual victimization alone, and also the overlap of sexual victimization with other forms of victimization. So before we were speaking about poly-victimization, that would go under this. Other components of the SALA study included an investigation of formal and informal help-seeking behaviors and responses. So this is something that is important for us to know in terms of being able to engage someone in treatment. They also explored the inclusion of culturally relevant variables such as religiosity, gender role, ideology, and acculturation, and we'll speak about this pretty soon, in relation to victimization and help seeking, as well as assessing the psychological impact of sexual victimization on psychological distress and post-traumatic symptomatology. So right here, we're beginning to see how all of these experiences begin to intersect. I mentioned it included a sample of 2,000 Latinas living in high-density Latino neighborhoods, and trained professionals conducted interviews over the phone, some in English and some in Spanish. So some numbers in terms of violence experiences among Latina, and as I mentioned, we're going to be speaking more specifically about sexual violence and intimate partner violence. So about 1 in 3 Latinas will experience intimate partner violence during her lifetime, and 1 in 12 has experienced intimate partner violence in the previous 12 months. This rate is approximately the same as for women from other racial and ethnic groups, and in fact, a recent study found no significant differences in terms of the numbers. This is from the National Latino Network, Latina. So also, Reported rates of intimate partner violence were lower for Mexican immigrants than for persons of Mexican descent born in the United States. These differences are consistent with other studies examining physical and mental health outcomes, school achievement, and substance use. So this is known as the immigrant paradox. And what we find that is referred to as the immigrant paradox is that persons who have been born in the United States or who have been in the US for longer periods of time tend to have higher rates of mental health disorders and substance use. This is known as the immigrant paradox because sometimes we would think that someone is immigrating looking for a better life and better health, and this is not always the case. So some hypotheses include, for the explanation of this, include that maybe the person's, someone who's able to go through the immigration process itself has to be really healthy in order to complete that process. So that person may be stronger psychologically in that way. Also, some other things that have been discussed in terms of immigration paradox include the possibility that being closer to your culture and will make you stronger in that way, the sense of belonging and adhering to your cultural values. Other explanations may include acculturation, and we will discuss that pretty soon. Okay? So, again, similar to national data, 1 in every 4 Latinas experience sexual abuse before the age of 18, and for Latinos, it's 1 in 7. Other numbers that I wanted to share with you, campesinas were found to be 10 times more vulnerable to experience sexual harassment or sexual assault. Also, for Latinas who travel between Mexico and the US, the incidence increased. That was a while ago, but still it's important to consider. And according to a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and again this is from a long time ago, 77 of interviewed Latinas reported sexual harassment as a problem in their area of work. And this is from a while ago, but this finding is real today. And we find, and we will discuss that a little bit later, but we find that with the current immigration policies and climate, women who immigrate who may not have all the legal documentation are more vulnerable to experience such things as sexual harassment, and sometimes legal status is used as a control mechanism for this type of behavior and for the aggressor to maintain power and control over someone. So immigrant status may be used as a control mechanism for sexual violence as well as intimate partner violence, because we may find a couple or where the man may use, again, the immigration status as a power and control mechanism to maintain his violent acts with the woman. This again may happen, as I mentioned, not only with campesinas and other workers, but also with domestic workers, who are a very vulnerable group. So what happens to someone who's had this type of experiences? So someone who experiences acts of violence, this may result in trauma or trauma symptoms. So trauma refers to an experience where your life, your safety, your integrity may be at risk or may be perceived to be at risk. So not only the real experience, but the perception that this is something that may happen to you may result in trauma. And what we find is that trauma responses are usually include intense emotions and strong physiological reactions. Okay, some of the symptoms that are associated with trauma experiences include reliving the experience through nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive memories, Some of the other symptoms that that may be a result of a trauma experience include avoiding certain situations, avoiding the area, for example, where the experience happened. It may include changes in affects and cognitions related to that experience. So even though not everyone that experiences trauma will have a post-traumatic stress disorder a diagnosis, they may not have all the criteria for such a diagnosis. We usually find, and we may find, that someone experiences symptoms or manifest symptoms that are related to PTSD and not necessarily the diagnosis itself. Okay, so we find that approximately 50% of all individuals will be exposed to at least one traumatic event in their life. So this is a pretty high number. And for those of you who are familiar with the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Effects study, we know that the number may be even higher. And this is something I wanted to mention with sexual violence and intimate partner violence. So we have the numbers that have been consistent throughout many years, I would say about since the 80s or 90s. We find that about 1 in 4 women may have a sexual abuse experience before the age of 18. These are the numbers that are disclosed. So we know the number is much higher. If we take into the consideration that usually about 12 to 16% of people who experience trauma disclose the information, then we know that this number is much higher. So with PTSD, not everyone develops symptoms, and there are certain variables that may come into play here. For example, we may have someone, what are some of the variables that may come into play here? Okay, so if you have a close relationship with your aggressor, that's one variable that, again, it's not going to be worse or it's not going to be better, it's just going to be a different experience, okay? It's going to manifest differently. So if the relationship with the aggressor is close, if you are younger in age, if the experience happened for longer periods of time, if the experience included physical violence, these are elements that we need to take into consideration to explore the intensity of symptoms and the manifestation of symptoms. We also find that for some survivors, symptoms may manifest physically. So we may find someone who has chronic stomach pains, who may have headaches, who may have nausea, and we want to be able to explore the possibility of it being a medical condition, and if that's not the case, we want to be able to find out if this is a way to manifest the intensity of an emotion that is related to a trauma experience. So what about violence, trauma? Okay, so we spoke about violence, we spoke about trauma, and now we're going into substance use disorders. Okay, so what the literature tells us is that between 30 to 59% of individuals who have substance use disorders present PTSD symptoms. And remember, we mentioned it's one thing PTSD symptoms and that's another the diagnosis. However, when we explore trauma histories, and we mentioned that about 50% of all individuals may experience at least one violence or trauma experience, the number changes from 55 to 99% of persons with substance use disorders have experienced trauma. So I'm going to get into that a little. So it's important to recognize that there's a very high possibility that some substance use may be a way to deal with some of the symptoms of the trauma experience. Okay. So with women with substance use disorders, look at the numbers now. Over 70% of women with substance use disorder report histories of sexual, physical, or emotional abuse in their lives. And as I mentioned before, when I was working at Proyecto Mujer, we were working with women, Latinas with substance use disorders, 95 to 97% reported intimate partner violence or sexual violence experiences. So women report higher number of perpetrators, more frequency, and for prolonged periods of time. So, as we discussed earlier, these are variables that may come into play in terms of the intensity of symptoms that they may manifest and their relationship with PTSD. So we're going to speak about, more specifically, about the vulnerabilities of Latinos. So in a study evaluating racial and ethnic differences among women with co-occurring mental and substance use disorder, Latinas possess significant social vulnerability, and some of the variables that may come into play regarding vulnerability to sexual or domestic or intimate partner violence include racism, poverty, lower socioeconomic status, lower educational attainment, and previous exposure to violence. So as I mentioned, among women, substance may be a way to cope with symptoms associated with an experience of violence. For clinicians who are working with women with substance use disorders, it's particularly important to explore violence experiences. The intersection points to the importance of integrating services for substance use and violence trauma experiences. So what we find sometimes is that programs that work with substance use disorders may not be ready to address trauma issues or violence issues, and the same happens for programs that work directly with trauma. They may not feel ready, or they may not be developed in a way that they are capable of addressing both issues simultaneously. So what we find is that someone may go to services for one reason, let's say substance use, and if you're exploring history and you find that there's a trauma experience, that person may be referred to a trauma center. And then what we're doing is we're fragmenting services, and this may not be in the best interest of the survivor. Another issue that is particularly important is that research has documented that various adverse effects related to trauma, physical and mental health, that result from intimate partner violence, including chronic pain, like I mentioned. Symptoms may manifest physically, injury, depression, PTSD, and substance use. Okay, so survivors who use substances, as we said before, it may be used to cope with the traumatic effects of abuse. Others, okay, so that may be the result of a trauma experience, and for others, they may be coerced to use substances by an abusive partner who then sabotages their efforts for recovery and may threaten to undermine with authorities or with immigration status or with the custody of the children. So we want to be able to explore all of these possibilities. In 2004, and I want to share this because this is universal to all women, in 2004 the United Nations held a meeting to speak about issues related to substance use treatment in women across the world. So during this meeting, some universal themes emerged, and they were identified and include shame and stigma, sexual and physical abuse, issues related to fear of losing their children, their partner, or understanding the need for approval from partners to receive services. So this may be a barrier to receiving services. Treatment issues such as lack of gender-specific treatment, lack of understanding of women's particular needs to receive services, long waiting lists, lack of coordination, and transportation. So again, this highlights the importance of integrated services for women. So a while ago, I mentioned that acculturation was a factor, and I want to speak a little bit more about that. Acculturation is the process by which someone from a different culture begins to adapt to the host culture. So what happens while someone is acculturating is that they begin, so if we think of culture as the values, norms, relationships, the way that define a group of people, so you take those with you to your new country. And then you may begin to adapt some of the new values, customs, and beliefs and practices of the host culture. So you have sort of let's say you begin to have a mix of both cultures, and this may create stress for some people. So acculturation stress, there are a lot of studies about acculturation stress that I invite you to look over. And what they evidence is that acculturation stress may be a contributing factor for mental health and substance use disorder. On the other hand, for people who are able to acculturate, this is a strength. So if we notice that someone is able to navigate through a new culture, bringing some of their own values and beliefs and maintaining the ones that are really important to them, and being able to switch back and forth. For example, you may find an adolescent who goes to school, speaks in English, is able to relate to his peers, and then he comes home, maybe his parents don't speak English, so he switches to Spanish. He or she is able to relate with his or her family in a different way. This is someone who's very strong, and we want to be able to incorporate that into treatment possibly. So in terms of particularities for Latino survivors, I want to share with you some of the values of the Latino culture that may be present in some way in the expressions of violence and in the definition and integration of that experience, as well as possibly manifestation of symptoms and the way that we seek services. And I want to point out that even though we're speaking about cultural themes and common themes among Hispanics and Latinos, this in no way, I in no way pretend to perpetuate any stereotypes. We address our clients as individuals and we recognize them as individuals, but these are some of the things that are common that have been evidenced in research, and we want to know about them so we can explore them, and maybe they are present for some of our clients and maybe they're not present for our Latino clients. So cultural values. Familismo. Familismo is the idea or is the value that family is very important. And this is true for many cultures. Many cultures recognize the importance of family. They live around family. For Latinos as well. It's more of a collective view than an individual view. And how may this affect someone who's going to treatment or someone who's experienced violence? So for a Latina who may be in an intimate partner violence relationship, some of the things that may happen, and again, we want to be able to explore, some of the things that may happen is that someone may think, well, I don't want to break up my family. So if family is of such importance, then that may be something that someone will consider or may decide, well, I'm not going to leave this relationship or I'm not going to seek services because that will break up my family. Also, something like another value regarding families or another aspect is that issues are discussed within the families, they're not brought out in public. So this in turn might have an impact in the way someone relates with you in a therapeutic relationship and the trust. So we want to be able to provide trust in the relationship so that someone is able to share some of these ideas with us. In terms of gender roles, again, every culture has, we mentioned in the beginning, this is the concept that is common for many cultures, and we have ideas about the way we relate to others and the way that we do many things, the way we manifest ourselves according to our sex, whether it be male or female. So same for Latinos. We have gender roles and we have expectations according to gender roles. And Marianismo is a term that has been used mostly in the past. We are moving differently. And Marianismo came from the Virgin Mary, the idea that motherhood is the most important role. So that may come into play with someone, but we recognize that with different generations, these terms have been changing. And again, another thing I want to point out is that in terms of cultural values, they may be strengths. So we want to be able to recognize that we can use these values as strength factors in the recovery process. So if we think about something like gender roles and motherhood, and that could be an important pathway for someone's recovery, connecting with the importance of being well for your children. So this will be a strength factor. Also, if a woman is able to take care of other members of her family, she can do that for herself. Maybe she can do that for herself, and we can again use these values as strengths. Confianza. Confianza is trust. Of course, trust is important for every relationship, and in terms of therapeutic relationships, everyone hopes for trust. We're not speaking specifically about Latinos. But if we consider, one of the things we can consider here is the issue of immigration. So immigration may play a role in the way that someone approaches treatment, and if they feel safe enough to share some of their information with you. So one of the ways to address it is that we make sure that we provide someone with the real information. We want to make sure that we let someone know what we can provide and what we cannot. So if your organization, is important for your organization to be clear about what are the rules regarding documentation, and you want to be able to convey that information to your participants. One of the things that may contribute to developing a trusting relationship is personalismo. Personalismo has been translated as optimal relatedness, and so that is a very friendly way to meet someone, a friendly way to relate with someone, but it's professional at the same time. So it doesn't mean that you don't have boundaries. It just means that you are friendly. You may have an informal conversation, but you are getting the information that you need for treatment. Again, with familismo, one of the things that is important to point out is that boundaries with families may be flexible, and that doesn't mean that there are no boundaries. It just means that they may manifest differently. So we may find one of the important concepts is the concept of interdependence. So family members rely on one another for many things. This doesn't mean that they depend on one another. It means that they consider each other while they're making decisions. Okay? And spirituality. Again, spirituality may be an important factor to consider. Sometimes spirituality may play a role in someone staying in an abusive relationship, and sometimes spirituality and churches and community may play a role in supporting someone in being able to live an abusive relationship. So we want to make sure to see where the person's at in terms of these values, and then work from there. So some factors that may come into play include economic factors such as employment issues. These are some of the things that Latinas identified as issues that come up for them in terms of being in intimate partner violence and experiencing that. For many Latinas, immigration may be the most salient aspect of their lives. As a result, decisions about relationships where there is violence may be deeply affected by their immigration status and by the climate in their communities. So this contextual factor may be a barrier in their ability to access resources. Anti-immigrant environments created by strict immigration policies and increased rates of deportation have impacted many Latino communities. For example, immigrant Latina women affected by intimate partner violence have reported experiences increased rates of, we mentioned this earlier, harassment, including reports of being followed by strangers, called derogatory words, and discrimination at work. Increased climate of fear due to the immigration enforcement environment was identified as a barrier to reporting or help seeking by 78% of respondents in this interview. And this was a national survey that was conducted by a domestic violence advocacy organization. Acculturation, and we discussed acculturation. In one study, an increased orientation towards American non-Latino culture was associated with symptoms of PTSD among Latina survivors, and again, this will be consistent with the immigrant paradox. And we should take into consideration definitely social-cultural factors. While the numbers of studies examining intimate partner violence in Latino populations is growing, research on this issue continues to be limited in quality and breadth. So there's some needs that have been identified by those groups who have been doing work with these communities. And some of the needs that have been identified include culturally responsive services, legal services, resources related to language and transportation. So again, I want to take from my experience at Proyecto Mujer, one of the things that we identified was difficulty in terms of transportation and arriving to treatment. So we were able to provide that service. And so that speaks of how you are able to identify the needs of your population and really design your program to address those needs. I'm noticing that I may not have enough time, but I'm gonna get to it. Okay. So barriers to services that were identified include immigration status, lack of awareness of services, and again, lack of culturally and linguistically appropriate services. As we mentioned with immigration status, this may be a control mechanism used by the aggressor. In terms of lack of awareness, sometimes stigma may be present and lack of culturally and linguistically appropriate services. So some of the possible challenges are related to those variables, of course, and they include language, not being able to provide services in Spanish, immigration status, anti-immigrant environment, access, and treatments that are not culturally responsive. And for those of you who work or may not work or may encounter a situation where someone is experiencing intimate partner violence or is a survivor of intimate partner violence or sexual violence, and is a person that is without legal documentation, there's an option, it's called the Visa U, the U non-immigrant status, U visa it's called, is set aside for victims that are survivors of such crimes. So that's something that you may want to inform your clients about. The difficulty may be maybe someone is not ready, because one of the things that they specify is that it is important that if you are asking for this visa, that you cooperate with legal agencies in terms of the act that was committed against you. So if someone is not ready emotionally to face something like that, this may not be an option, but if someone is, this is an option. So resilience among Latinas again has to do with the cultural values, social and family support, familismo may be a strength factor, spirituality, and all of the cultural values. So we want to be able to explore what this experience means to someone, what it means for their community. So the way they define the experience, the way they describe it, the words that they use are important and help us identify where the person is at in terms of that experience, so that we can work from there. So in terms of recommendations, it is very important to explore trauma experiences that may have occurred prior to, during, or after immigration. So with Latinas, one of the things that we find is that we spoke about polyvictimization, someone may have experienced trauma prior to coming to the US, during the journey and after the journey. So we want to be able to explore those possibilities and the impact that these experiences may have had. Provide alternatives for Spanish-speaking Latinas, consider and integrate values, and consider, of course, immigration status. Some clinical recommendations include conduct an initial assessment to determine the level of acculturation, development, and identification of ethnic identity. Provide clients with opportunities to identify and express feelings about their heritage and self-perception. Encourage exploration of strength in their cultural backgrounds, histories, and heritage, including opportunities to explore old and new ways to incorporate spirituality into their lives. Develop opportunities to build alliances and relationships with women from other groups and other cultures. For program developers, I wanted to include some information as well. Generate a program philosophy that supports personal growth and empowerment within a cultural and family context. Develop linkages with other community resources and case management to help with legal issues, education, job training, IPV, medical care, housing, and other support systems. Plan for interpreter services if you don't have bilingual providers. Adopt acculturation assessment tools that include immigration or immigration patterns, acculturation level, experiences, stress, country of origin, and specific endorsement of Latinos' values. Something I want to mention is that Hispanics and Latinos is a very heterogeneous group, so country of origin may play a role in the way that symptoms manifest. And staff training. Invest in culturally competent staff training that promotes an understanding of common Latina cultural beliefs, worldviews, customs, spirituality, religion, the possible relational needs of many Hispanic Latina, the centrality of family, and knowledge of approaches for incorporating family into treatment. The immigration experience and effects of acculturative stress on many Latinas, roles, responsibilities, family life, substance use, and recovery. So I included this information, but it's really for you guys to have additional resources, and these are some models that have been proven to be effective with women and integrate violence experiences, trauma symptoms, and substance use. So I'm going to name them before we go into questions, but this is additional resources for you. I included Women Integrated Treatment by Stephanie Covington. This is a very rich treatment that includes the experiences of women, takes into consideration the specific needs, and it includes 3 theories that are the relational cultural theory, addictions theory, and trauma theory. So you have the information. I also included some EVPs that are specific for women with substance use and trauma experiences, A Woman's Path to Recovery, the Boston Consortium model, and Seeking Safety, which is the EVP that we use for Proyecto Mujer. So I know that I've taken a little bit longer, but that's my presentation. And
that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. We did get a question during the presentation. It's as asking, does substance use increase prior or after trauma? I'm sure you probably touched on that, but do you mind reiterating on that?
Yeah, so regarding substance use, after trauma, if it is used to cope with symptoms related to trauma, yes, it will increase. And it might increase at different points if there are triggers that are triggering some of our symptoms. If we have throughout our lives, we may have a trauma experience, and then we may experience triggers usually through our senses. So we may see someone who is similar to our aggressor, we may hear something, we may smell a perfume. So those type of triggers may result in increased symptomatology, including intense emotions. And in that sense, if that happens, yes, substance use may increase because it is a way to cope with the increased emotions. But you would have to look at at what is going on at
Thank
that point
you.
in time.
And one last question. What advice would you give to health professionals that are newly working with the Latinx, or Hispanic population about substance use prevention and treatment? Are there any a person that is new to this demographic? Would you give anything, just a synopsis or a quick advice for that as well?
Okay, so is this in terms of substances specifically for Latinos or
Exactly.
someone who's working with substance use and among Latinos, right? Latinas. Okay, so I think that you could read about it. I think that one of the terms that has been used that I connect with is cultural humility, and that the idea that you remain humble in recognizing that you may not know everything about a person's culture, but you're opening to listen to someone else. So what I would advise anyone is to ask the questions and be open to listening to the experience of the person in front of you. So they may, I would also recommend to um, learn about the culture, but really learn from the expert, and that is the person beside that is right in front of you. So maintaining
Very
an
good
open
and
approach
practical
would,
advice.
would
Thank you
really
so
help.
much. And thank you for being our speaker today. You were great. We learned a lot and had such a great perspective put in front of us today. And we want to thank our participants as well for coming and listening and participating. And you all are always a great crowd, and we really appreciate you all meeting us here every week or every month. Again, all of these materials will be available on our website at a later date, and be sure to look into your inboxes for our next registration for our next session. Again, thank you so much, and you all have a great rest of your week.